Like many of us in this room, he served our country. His name is Edgar Harrell, United States Marine, and survivor of the USS Indianapolis. The USS Indianapolis may ring a bell for many of you because its sinking during World War II is widely known as the largest casualty at sea in the history of the United States Navy. When Japanese bombers sunk the ship, 1,197 men were on board that day, but only 317 remained when help arrived 5 days later. Mr. Harrell is one of those survivors and recounts the harrowing tale in his book, Out of the Depths, published in May of last year. Each of you should have received a signed copy of his book at registration today. His story is nothing short of a miracle, fascinating and terrifying at the same time, defining what it truly means to be a hero. Without further ado, please help me welcome Mr. Edgar Harrell, United States Marine Corps.
And thank you so very, very much. It's indeed an honor to be with you good people today, and I recognize this as somewhat of a cross-section of the state of Georgia, and I'm honored to be with you. And thank you, good President, Chairman, for the invitation some 6 months ago, and I'm honored to be here with you. Now then, I saw some of my contemporaries, I believe, a little bit ago. World War II, anyone? World War II? There's one gentleman back there. Okay, all right. Aren't many of us still living, but may I just say this, you take a good look at this 91-year-old World War II Marine, and you know why the Marine Corps is still looking for a few good men. Now, I've got a long story to tell, and I think I'm a little bit on a clock, so let me just take you back some 70-plus years as an 18-year-old boy in Kentucky. And some of you heard of Walter Winchell. Walter Winchell, we could hear him on our old Silvertone battery-operated radio telling what was happening in the Pacific. And I tell my dad, I'm already registered for the draft, but I don't want to wait and be drafted. I want to volunteer for the Marine Corps. I did so, and I passed the physical up in Evansville, Indiana, and they said, you have to go to Indianapolis, Indiana to be sworn into the Marine Corps. That was my first visit to Indianapolis. And then from there, they send me home for a few days, and I show up in San Diego, boot camp. And after boot camp, they said, you're going to sea school. Well, I needed more schooling, but I learned quickly that sea school meant that I would be seagoing. And so I go up to San Francisco, and you can imagine what a country boy from Kentucky thought when he saw that big ship, twice the length of a football field, and that's to be my home for the duration of the war. And soon after I went aboard, we were at Kwajalein, Winnie and Weetalk, and then I was at Saipan, Tinian, Guam, Sea Battle of the Philippine Seas. I was down in Peleliu. I was at Iwo Jima at Okinawa, 3 airstrikes on Tokyo. And lastly, I was a Marine Guard that guarded Fat Man and Little Boy. You know who they were? Fat Man and Little Boy, the code name for the 2 atomic bombs that would be dropped at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was at Okinawa that we had received a kamikaze plane. We lost several boys. I can see that plane today as it was diving to the fantail where I was on a 40 millimeter ammunition gun. And some 10 seconds or so from the time the boatswain blew the whistle to set emergency in the anti-aircraft batteries, he hit. And when he hit on the edge of the ship. One bomb went all the way through, went through the mess hall, a berthing compartment, a water distilling plant, went through the bottom of the ship, and it exploded on that big shaft that turns those screws. We had to come to the States for repair. Soon after repair, we noticed out on the dock on July the 16th, 1945, we noticed all kinds of brass out there, Navy and Marine Corps brass. And then we saw our crane reaching over out on that dock, and there was a big, big, big crate out there. Sometimes I say it's like my fish store, it gets a little bigger each time, but it was a big box. And they picked that up and set it on the quarterdeck, and my Marine captain said, "Harold, station a guard in the port hangar deck." "Captain Parks, what are we guarding?" He said, "We don't know." We didn't know. And it's a possibility that even the skipper of the ship did not know. But momentarily there were a couple of Air Force officers that came aboard. And when they came aboard, they had a little canister in a metal cage with a padlock on it. Again, Captain Parks says, "Harold, station a guard on that, follow them up and station a guard on the outside of the hatch up there." Well, who are they and what's in a little cage? He said, "We don't know." May I say they were not Air Force officers. They were scientists from Los Alamos, New Mexico. Now you get the connection. And what they had was half of the uranium that America owned at that half. The other half was in San Francisco. Once we delivered that, a B-29 would bring the rest of that to Tinian Ann Island. We loaded that aboard, and before we could go very far, we had to stop off at Guam, Central Pacific Command, for Captain Parks to receive his sailing orders. Now, our ship was the flagship of Admiral Spruance, and we pretty much knew the scuttlebutt, and the scuttlebutt was that we indeed were going to invade Japan with some 2 million of our troops. Britain would join us with another 1 million. And we knew that that was our destination, and they tell us, yes, you're to go to the Philippines to prepare for the main invasion of Japan. Captain Parks, Captain McVeigh asked for his sailing orders, and they tell him where to go, but he asked for an escort and tell him you don't need an escort. But they were not telling him the truth. They could have said, you need an escort because 4 days ago we lost a destroyer, USS Underhill. We lost 129 boys. They could have said, you need an escort because we know that the Taman group of submarines are working in those waters. We've broken the Japanese code. We know everything that they're doing out there. They don't tell us that. They tell us that we can go unescorted, meaning that we had no underwater sound gear. We could not detect anything below the surface. And so on July the 16th now, we have our cargo aboard, and we're going to Tinian Island. May I say that's some 5,300 miles. Would you believe it that we made it in 10 days? 530 miles a day in a heavy cruiser, some 32 knots, and that was about as fast as it would go. Some indication that Captain McVeigh knew to some degree what we had, because that particular morning when we left San Francisco a few days before, that particular morning, something happened in Los Alamos, the first atomic explosion, and it was successful. So by now, we kind of get the message of what maybe we had been carrying. But he asked for an escort. They refused us, and we set sail. And Commander Hoshimoto, a commander of a Japanese submarine, was waiting somewhat out in those waters in kind of the crossroads out there. he had not been successful the whole war in getting a combatant ship. He has a little periscope sticking up out of the water, and he picks us up at a distance away, let's say 10 miles out. That particular night, it was sufficiently dark that at the change of the watch at 8 o'clock, Captain McVeigh had orders to zigzag at his discretion. Okay, we've slowed down to 15 miles an hour or so, and so he came out on the bridge and told the lieutenant in charge at the change of watch, cease zigzag. And so we're heading on a straight course, Commander Hoshimoto waiting, and he picks us up. He tells the crew to load the torpedoes. They loaded 6 torpedoes. He tells them also there is what we call a Keynote, which is a torpedo that 2 men will get in that, and they can control it, and they can turn and come back at their target. The only disadvantage is it cannot be recovered. 2 boys wanted to be in one, and they were in one. The 2 for the other Keynote were not in that. Commander Hoshimoto says, we have 2 good targets. Let's wait and see if we're successful with these. And so he has them to stand by. Fire! Fire! Every 2 seconds he fires a torpedo. Now, 2 of those torpedoes were successful. I recall that I had gotten off a watch that particular night. I had the guard duty and secured the watch, and I go below deck down the marine compartment, and I get my blanket because Captain McVeigh had been on the speaker, and he says, gentlemen, it's 110 degrees out today. We had no air conditioning aboard ship. We had good hot pumped air in, but no air conditioning. And he said, you're welcome, since we are slowed down to some 15 miles an hour or so, you're welcome to get you a pallet or your blanket and come topside and make you a little pallet for the night. And so when I got off watch at 12 o'clock, I go down to the marine compartment. I don't get my Kapok life jacket. I have on my dungaree clothing. I get my blanket, and I go topside, and I go all the way forward. I go up to what we call number 1 turret, big 8-inch guns, 3 barrels of 8-inch guns. And I made my pallet right down on the deck. Now, I took off my shoes, had my clothing on. I took off my shoes, and you know the arch of the shoe makes a pretty good pillow. I put my blanket on that, and I kind of put it over my head because we're moving at 15 miles an hour, and it's a little breezy, you know. And I had just begun, no doubt, to doze off to sleep, and all of a sudden, a massive explosion. That first torpedo cut about 40 feet of that bow of the ship off. When I say cut it off, it wasn't there. I was within 30 feet of that. And then the second torpedo was back close to the marine compartment, and no one in that whole lower part of the ship survived. And I realized nearly instantly that the ship was doomed. That second torpedo set the magazine under number 2 turret, set it off, and the explosion moves that turret off and sets it to one side somewhat. And so you knew that the ship was doomed. But I could look forward to me from where I was. Within 30 feet of me, there was no bow of the ship. It was off. It was not there. And we're nearly 30 feet wide there. We're 2.5 decks deep there. And you can imagine those screws are still turning, pushing forward. You could hear and feel all of that water coming in. You could hear the bulkheads down below, that steel metal, you know, you could nearly feel it breaking. And I knew that the ship was doomed. And I realized I've got to get back midship, which is my emergency station. My lieutenant would be there to give me orders as to what I'm to do. And at that time, did not know whether we were in combat to be firing or what we were to do. But as I started back midship, I have to go by somewhat compartments of officers' quarters forward. And as I was going by there, you could see officers that were coming out, and many of them were flash burned, and many of them were having to touch the hot bulkheads, and they leave the skin of their hands on the bulkheads. They are out on the open deck, and they're maybe just in their night skivvies pleading for someone to give them some assistance, but that's not my responsibility, and really nothing that I knew to be able to do for them. I knew that I had to get to my emergency station, and I know by now that the bow of the ship is already nearly completely under. And as I make my way then back to midship, I realize I don't have a life jacket, and this ship is sinking. That second torpedo on the starboard side, now the ship is listing to the starboard to where you can hardly stand on the deck. But I'm making my way back midship. I get back on the quarterdeck. My Marine lieutenant was there, and Lieutenant Stauffer permission to cut down big canvas bags of those Kapok life jackets. And his response was, not until we get word to abandon ship. The ship is sinking. In fact, nearly by now, the ship is listing to the starboard, and normally the quarterdeck would be 8 feet above waterline. There's water on the quarterdeck. The first 100 yards of the ship, there's water on the surface deck. And we are in need of a word to come down to abandon ship, or the ship is going to leave us. And I asked my lieutenant permission to cut down those Kapok jackets, and he said, not until we get word to abandon ship. Well, there was a Navy commander that came from below deck, and as he came through the hatch, I recognized who he was, but he was nearly beyond recognition because his clothing and his face had been flash burned. And some sailor hollered out, get the commander of life jacket, and they began to cut down those life jackets. And probably there might have been 100 men on the quarterdeck, and we were reaching in and grabbing to get us a Kapok life jacket. Now, if you don't know what a Kapok life jacket is, you know what a horse collar is? Imagine a horse collar made into a vest made out of a material that is flotation material. I managed to get me a Kapok jacket. I put it on, but I didn't fasten it in the straddle because I knew that momentarily I'm going to be leaving the ship, or the ship is going to leave me. And we were desperate for a word to come down to abandon ship. You could see the bridge up there, and the good captain is on duty there. I had been there earlier, and so we are waiting for word. He had sent someone below deck to check and see if the ship was salvageable. They never made it back to the surface. And so the ship went down in about 12 minutes, so most of that 12 minutes has already passed. And then finally we could hear different ones, and the word, abandon ship, abandon ship, abandon ship, abandon ship. As word came down to the quarterdeck where we were, and you can imagine bedlam of maybe 100 of us on the quarterdeck, we would not go off on the starboard side. The water is already there. And we get off on the high side over on the port side, and to make my way over to that steel cable and look out into the blackness of the night and look out at all of that oil on the water. And I'm going to go into that. And there were several jumping off ahead of me, some jumping on each other. I'm holding on to that steel cable, and I'm looking out into maybe this is the end of life. Life is over. And may I say, there's times when you pray, and there's times when you pray, and there is a difference. And as I held on to that rail, I tell the Lord, I don't want to die. I don't know what all I promised, maybe much more than I lived up to, but I made him promises, and I tell him, I don't want to die. Mom and Dad back home, 6 younger brothers, an older sister and a younger sister, and a special person, a certain brunette, that said that she would wait for me. And I'll get ahead of my story and say, and she waited, and we were married in 1947. We just spent our 68th anniversary, and I called her last evening. She's still waiting. So, thank you. So I'm praying, Now, there was no audible word that came to me, no. But there was a word that came to me, I'll never leave you nor forsake you. Peace I give unto you, not as the world giveth, give I unto you. Let not your hearts be troubled. Don't be afraid. Something maybe I learned as a youngster in Sunday school, that came to mind, and I had to say, Lord, you're speaking to me. I'm going to make it. Now, I didn't know I'm going to be out there 4.5 days, and I'm holding on to that rail. I climbed over that rail, and by now, the keel of the ship is nearly as level as the deck, and I stepped over that rail. I made 2 big, long steps, jumped into that water feet first. That kapok jacket came up over my head, and now I have to get my head above all of that oil to swim away then from the ship, to look back and see now the first 100 yards is under. That fantail is coming high in the air, and those screws are still turning. Boys were making their way any place they could get off of the ship. Some actually were jumping. They could not see the blackness below. They could not see those screws turning. Some actually jumped into those screws. We saw that. And then I saw the ship, then as she turned to the starboard, and went completely under. I'm making my way out to some buddies out there, and after a bit, I saw the ship as she went completely under, and I made my way to this little group, and we saw that we had several that did not have kapok life jackets, and some were maybe wounded rather severely that didn't make it till daybreak. And it was about 80 of us in that little group. Now there were others all scattered all over. We surmise maybe that 900 of us are in the water someplace out there. But I began to check the little group that I was in to see if there's other Marines in the group. Well, there were 2 other Marines, one by the name of Spooner, and I'll tell you about him maybe a little later. The other Marine was a new recruit that had come aboard, and he was not in my squad. I was a squad leader, but he was not in my squad. And I knew he was a Marine, and I came up to him to try to find out his condition. Well, he had been blown against a bulkhead, no doubt multiple breaks in his body, and he could, he was dying, basically. Maybe he may have lived an hour, but now he's gone. And then the other Marine, I'll get back to him later. But we were losing boys because of injuries, and many did not have kapok jackets, so they're hanging on to someone else. And now this, mind you, this is 14 minutes or so after midnight. Now it's rather dark out, and lot of noise. You can imagine. Many were injured, and we're trying to assist them. And then it isn't long until daybreak. Daybreak comes, we have company. When I say we have company, you could look out in any given time nearly, and you could see a big fin swimming around our group. And you can imagine what that's doing to you now. In fairness to the sharks, they were not attacking us, but just to see that, you could expect that momentarily they are going to attack you. Well, momentarily, maybe someone has been injured and now he has a high temperature, he's hallucinating, and all of a sudden he imagines that he sees an oasis out there. And he's going to swim out to that. And here he starts, and he gets out 75 yards or so, and all of a sudden you hear a blood-curdling scream, and you look, and you see that kapok went under. Momentarily it came to the surface, and then after it came to the surface, then you could see fins. You dared not to go and check to see who your buddy might have been. Sometime later, maybe you want to know who your buddy might have been, and you check him. You find out that the bottom torso is gone, or he's disemboweled. And so that's taken place many, many times, even the first day. And now it's 110 degrees out. You're bareheaded, you're swimming. I did have my clothing on. Many, all they had on was just their navy, their skivvies. And okay, we go through that day, hot, and you're having to swim in that old kapok jacket. You're swimming to maybe to protect yourself because you want to stay in a group, surmising that you see them out here singles and you hear what's taking place. So we form a circle. We would take our kapok jackets and make a circle and try to keep some of those that did not have kapok jackets hanging onto someone else, and some that were injured, keep them kind of in the circle because we're on maybe 8 or 10 foot swells. And you can imagine if this row right here, all of a sudden, you are on a swell and you go up and then you begin to, that swell breaks and now you're scattered. So how do we keep all of you together? We form a circle and try to keep everyone in the circle, and that lasts for a little while. But it isn't long till someone hallucinates and he's unhooked and he's out and you hear the scream, and that's going to take place many times. Let's go through that first day. Let's come to the second day, but we go through the second night before we come to the second day. The second night, it's 85-degree water, but I don't know what the temperature is, but you go out and get just soaking wet and a little breeze stirring, and it isn't long until that body temperature, 98, it drops a degree or two every hour, and now it's down to where you are having to work even to stay halfway warm, even with your clothing on. But your temperature, if it finally, say, hits about 85 below, that's too late. It's all over. Hypothermia, and you're gone. So that's going to take place many, many times. Okay, the second day, though, 110 degrees, you're swimming. You're swimming to help a buddy or to stay in the group or to help someone that's having some difficulty. And so you're desperate for water. Well, you see boys that would tear off some of their clothing and make a little strainer and put some water up in that, put their head under it, and drink of some of that salt water. And within the hour, I can tell you what happened. Within an hour, he did not know who his buddy might have been. His buddy might be a Jap, and he might attack his buddy. Or in this one case, his buddy, he thought had a canteen of water in his kapok jacket. He took out his sheath knife, and he went at him with vengeance and stabbed him, and then all that blood, you can imagine what's going to take place. Okay, now here we are, though, we're in the second day, and we're so thirsty, and we're desperate for water. And then all of a sudden you look at, like you see here in Georgia, I think where I am, a little rain cloud, you see it coming. Look, it's raining. And that was the case. Look, it's raining. Look. And as that little rain cloud came over, what do? I'll tell you what you do. You open your mouth heavenward and you pray for a few drops of water. By now, your lips are swollen. They're cracked open. And all of that salt and all of that oil. And by now, in that 110-degree weather, believe me, your tongue is swelling. And you are desperate for water. Thank you, Lord. Thank you, Lord. And the little rain cloud comes over. How much water? I tried it one day just for the fun of it. It's a little rain shower much, much after 70 years ago, just to see. Okay, you open your mouth. I've got a pretty big mouth, but, you can't catch much water. But back then, that little rain, it washed all of that oil off of my face down, and I'm swallowing some of that. And then, oh my. Anyway, so we took our greasy hands and we somewhat funneled some water and we drank some of that salt water. But just after a minute or two, you can imagine that oil on her hands, on her face. Now, we swallowed that. And after just a little while, you know what? It wants to come up, and it does. And so maybe we had gotten some water that that stayed. That's all the water that I had in 4.5 days. Okay, let's take it through that second day. Sometime that second day, my Marine buddy Spooner, he'd gone into the water head first. And you can imagine diving into a half inch of that black oil, how are you going to get that out? You aren't. And then that salt water, if you look up at the sun, it turns to powder, so you're going to grind that in your eyes. And his eyeballs were just two big red sores. Finally, the second day, he could not close his eyes. His eyes were open, but just two big red sores. And he tells me, Harold, we know no word has got off the ship for any kind of an SOS, and or at least no one is looking for us, because we see planes flying over 30,000 feet, but no one's looking for us. Our B-29's bombing Tokyo, and so he's going to commit suicide, he thinks. Spooner, how are you going to do it? I saw that he really meant he was going to do it, and he was in misery. And so he said, I'll dive down so far I'll drown before I come up. I knew he meant it, and I kind of used a little effort and grabbed him, and I said, Spooner, there's 2 Marines in this group. There's going to be 2 Marines when rescue comes, and rescue is coming. And so I fastened his cape-out jacket onto mine. We swam together through that night. Now we come into the third day. Now, the third day, it's hot, hot, hot. We have no energy, and 8-foot swells or so. So what do you do? Again, I say there's times when you pray, and sometime the third day at noon, you know, I said there's about 80 of us to begin with. There's 17 of us. 17. What's happened? They aren't with us anymore. Hypothermia, salt water, our sharks. Okay, anyway, there's 17 of us. And we see planes, 30,000 feet. We know that that's our bomb in Tokyo, because our ship is a flagship of Admiral Spruitt's, and we knew all the scuttlebutt and much of what was happening. And so here we're desperate. Okay, sometime then that third day, there were 17 of us, and we're together, and we are seeing the planes. But what can we do? And someone would say, we have to pray. And I can hear this one sailor praying now. God, if you're out there, I don't want to die. I've got a son back home I've never seen, but we have to have help. We won't make it. Well, we did have help, but he did not make it. And so what do? We pray, we prayed. We repeated prayers, and for a good long period of time, and all of a sudden we realized that our cape-out jackets now are so waterlogged that they aren't really holding our head out of water, and so we're having to swim. And one of the boys said, let's take them off and sit in them. And so we take off our cape-out jackets, and they have the same buoyancy. The only thing, they're down a little further under you. And now we do that, and now we're having to swim to keep our heads above the water. And then maybe if you don't continue to swim, it will pitch you, and now you got to try to get that inner tube back under you, out in a swimming pool. Yeah. Anyway, to get that cape-out jacket back under, it was a struggle, but we get it back under us, and now we still having to swim. Okay, let's go through that afternoon now, that third day, and sometime later in the afternoon, we came upon a swell, and it said, "Look, what is that?" That looked like a little raft, and you know how your voice will carry on the water. And after a period of time, we are in maybe 8 or 10 foot swells. It's up when we're up, and we could make contact by voice, and they responded, and it isn't long till they're coming. And we could see it's a little makeshift of a raft. And after a period of time, they're getting closer to us. We're making our way to them. And it isn't long till here they are, a little raft. There were 5 sailors around the raft. No one was on the raft. No one on the raft? No. 5 sailors around a little makeshift of a raft consisted of 3 40-millimeter ammunition cans and something like an old slatted orange crate or potato crate, 3 or 4 of those, and they had lashed those together, and they had taken kapok jackets off of boys already expired and squeezed them out and put them up on that little raft. And anyway, you know, that old sponge won't hold any more water, but if you squeeze it out, it'll hold some more, has more buoyancy. So they show us and help us to take off our kapok jackets, and 2 boys then squeeze those in opposite directions and to put them up on that little raft. Okay, and they say to we 17, 2 Marines and 15 sailors, anybody want to join us? And I say to my buddy Spooner, I'm going to go with them. He said, Harold, if you go, I'm going with you. 2 Marines joined 5 sailors. We think that we're going to push that little raft to the Philippines. Our other sailors say, you're crazy. You can't push that raft to the Philippines. Now, we didn't know it was another 500 miles, but when you see a group of 80 go down to 17, it's time to do something. And Spooner and I joined those 5 sailors, and it isn't long that we've left our buddies. We have a spare life jacket, and we're plugging away, and the sun goes down in the west, and normally we're able to see the Southern Cross, and of course we can see the moon at night. We know the location of that at that time of year and all, and so we think that we're making headway, and we were making some headway, but sometime then later than that afternoon, we're plugging away. We've left our buddies behind, and we came up on a swell, and I can see myself now right up on the front corner of that raft, plugging away, and now we see it's going to get overcast, and that's still west. We know we can see the light, even though the sun is not there. That's west, but it isn't long until we aren't going to be able to see that. And then we came up on a swell, and I said, look, there's some debris out there. Well, what could that be? And finally, it's up when we're up, and I said, I'm going to swim out and get it. And there was a kind of a compelling influence. I'd go and see what that might be. And so I put my kapok jacket kind of on like a vest, and I'd do a dog paddle, and I swam out to that little object, ever what it might be, praying that it could be water or it could be food, could be something. And when I got within about 6 to 8 feet or so of that old potato crate, you know, I didn't pause, and I saw those potatoes floating in that little crate. I didn't pause, thank you, Lord, for what I'm about to partake of. But in desperation, I'm reaching for that first potato. And as I got that first potato, kind of in the agony of defeat, as I squeezed that rot squeezing through my fingers, and now to take that and peel it somewhat with your hand, peel it with your teeth, you don't spit out all the rot. It was solid on the inside. Now, you ladies know what rotten potatoes smell like. I know what they taste like. And I had a little bit of solid potato. That was the food that I had for 4.5 days. And now I swam back to my buddies, and they see that I'm eating something. What is it? Rotten potatoes. But they leave the raft. They came out and joined me, and we had a little picnic. All we had to eat was half-rotten potatoes, but no ants to bother us. And anyway, so now we're struggling still. We see that west is still visible to say the west is in that direction, somewhat. But no moon, no Southern Cross, and of course the sun had been gone for a good while. Okay, so we're plugging away there sometime that night, and we hear voices. Now, may I say, there's times you can hear voices, believe me. There's times when you can see things that aren't there. There's times when you can hear things that maybe didn't exist because you want to hear, you're desperate to hear. But we heard voices, and so we responded, and after a period of time, here came a gentleman, a Navy lieutenant that I knew because oftentimes I was the captain's orderly, and he was the officer of the deck, and here he's Lieutenant McKissick from Texas, and oftentimes he would give me a message to go and tell the captain, and the greenhorn that I was, I did not know the nomenclature that he was trying to tell me to tell someone else, especially my captain, and he would say, "Hey, Marine, repeat that." I would repeat it maybe the third time. "Okay, go and tell the good captain." And so anyway, here's McKissick. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sailors. We never did know, but they were coming in because they could hear our voices, and so they came into our group. And so here was a Marine that had a pocket full of half-rotten potatoes and some still in that crate that we put up on that little raft. So as they came into our group, we were sharing half-rotten potatoes with them. And McKissick says, "You're not going to push that raft to the Philippines." We said, "Yes, we are," because of our jackets. And their jackets were just nearly completely gone. And we showed them how, if they would take off their jacket, we could twist them in opposite direction and squeeze some of the water out. And we had some at least a little drier than what they had. And so here, they have a spare tire. Now then, the wind calmed down, the waves calmed down the rest of that night, probably to the extent that with a little bit of a spare tire, a spare life jacket, and a little bit of potato to eat, the next morning at daybreak, I'm with McKissick and one sailor. "Where's my buddy Spooner?" "I don't know." "Where's the raft?" "I don't know." And I'm desperate to find Spooner, and I'm desperate to find that raft, but, in the next morning it's 8-foot swells, so you're down and it's out there someplace, but you don't see it, and maybe you are separated. We don't know how far we were from it. And so here I am with McKissick and one sailor. And now here it is, the fourth day. And so McKissick, knowing me, asked me, "Hey, Marine, have you ever been to the Philippines?" "No, I never have." And he said, "Maybe help will come, and if we make it," he promised to take me under wing. Okay, I saw this other sailor, and I saw what he was doing was what I had seen so many do. And I often say, it's much, much easier to die than it is to live. You have to work to live, but all you have to do out there to die is just quit, just give up. And he was giving up. I saw that his head had already dropped in the water. I go over and I shook him and tried to encourage him to hang in there, buddy. Help will be here tomorrow. And he could care less. The second time, the same thing. The third time I checked him, it's too late. He'd already given up completely. Just McKissick and myself. And McKissick said, "Marine, you ever been to the Philippines?" He'd take me under wing once we made it, he would tell me. And so we were struggling. We're the only two that we knew were around anywhere. And then all of a sudden, we looked, and I said, look, I see a plane. Look, I see a plane. And what would you do? We saw a plane maybe 3,000 or 4,000 feet up. You could hear it. And what do? You wave, you splash water. No doubt you holler. You do everything in your power to attract his attention. But let me take you up there, Lieutenant Gwynn, flying that Ventura. I call it a B-25 in it. It was a twin-engine plane with wheels on it. And I could see him there. And we're waving. Thank you, Lord. Look, he's coming in. And he did. He was coming in. You could tell he was coming down. But let me take you up there. Here he's flying at, say, 4,000 feet. He's looking forward of him, let's say, 4 miles. He's looking at his peripheral vision, 2.5 miles each side. He's looking at 20 square miles. And to see a man's head down here 6 by 8 inches, impossible. Let me take you up there, though, and tell you what's happening. Lieutenant Gwynn, flying that Ventura, was having trouble with his radio. That antenna, the stabilizer on that had come off, and that antenna was just flipping back and forth. And he says to the co-pilot, take over control. I'm going to pull that antenna in and put a sock or stabilizer on it, or else we can't reach back base. We see him at a given time, and so he goes and he opens the bomb bay door. He glances down, and that sun hitting a little oil, no doubt, on our clothing. He saw an oil slick. He rushed back to take over control of the plane, and when he took over control of the plane, the crew says, "What is it? What is it?" And he said, "Look down there." Well, you don't look out of a plane at 4,000 feet and see much down there. But what he had saw through that little opening in the bottom of that plane was that oil slick, and the sun hit that. And I spoke to the 100th anniversary of the Boy Scouts out in Spokane, some 5,400 scouts. I said, you know what he saw? He saw your little mirror. That sun hit that oil, and he saw that. And so what does he do? He rushes back to take over control of the plane. He reaches and he gets the mic. Load the bombs. Load the bombs. Literally, he loaded the bombs. He was coming in on the bombing run. We see him. Thank you, Lord. Thank you. He sees us. And he did. He had not seen us, but he saw the oil slick. And when he came down, then he got down in under that 2,000 feet. He could see debris, he could see sharks, he could see few stragglers, and well, we were scattered over, I would say, 25 miles, all kinds of debris, bodies already decomposed and so on. But we see him, and he comes down, and I can see him today, Lieutenant Gwynn, as he circled McKissick and myself, several times. I can see his visage in that cockpit as he circled us, and then he goes up. And later I asked him, why did you leave us and go back up? He said, I had to get back up to where I could reach back in Palouse to announce there's ducks on the pond. Whose ducks? No one knows at that time. Okay, he reaches Palouse, and Lieutenant Adrian Marks from Indiana was already gassed up, loaded up to go out on a search and destroy in a PBY looking for submarines. And he gets our coordinates, and he responds to Gwynn, it's 150 miles, an hour and a half or so. I'm on the way. And Gwynn says, I'll stay for a period of time. And so he's taking inventory over a big area, but he can't land. Marks is on his way, and he flies over the USS Doyle, a destroyer, and he's radio contact to tell him that at a certain distance up there, there's all kinds of boys scattered out there. And so the Doyle, he heads in high gear. It isn't long until Marks comes in that PBY, and I can see him today as he comes over. He was taking maybe some inventory, and then he has seen that there are boys on floater nets, 2 or 3 life rafts with 2 or 3 boys in it, but mostly were smaller groups and stragglers. And he said he saw one group of some 30 boys, but more than 30 sharks attacking the boys. And so what does he do? He gets on the radio to Palouse and asks permission to do a no-no, and that is to set a PBY down in an open sea with 8-foot swells. And they tell him no way, but he nevertheless, I can see him as he came down slower and slower, and it looked like he just nearly stalled. And he hit that first swell and jumped up in the air and down again, and then that one prop then hit all of that bank of water and tore up a motor that would never run again. He ruptured the pontoon a little bit. Now, he and the crew said, we have to land. Now, they didn't know whether they were Japanese boys or Americans, but he saw sharks attacking the boys. And so he landed that. And then he began to pick up stragglers. As long till he picked up, I knew he picked up McKissick, but we're separated, and he can't turn toward me because he has to run the swells and get to a place that he can get across before he could get over to me. But finally he come, and they threw out a little ring, and I managed to come out of my jacket, and they pulled me over to that plane. Never did stop the plane, pulled me over to it and pulled me in, and like a sack of feed, they set me in. And may I say, he picked up 56. If you know anything about a PBY, and I've had different ones to say, that won't hold 56. And my response is, it will if you tie 7 out on the wings. And there were 7 out on the wings. I have a buddy up in Tennessee, was out one of the 7 anyway, and he's still living today. But anyway, here we are, 56 of us. Now, I'm aboard a plane, and I'm like a sack of feed just stacked in there. And after a little bit, I'm looking across, and I see a blonde-headed boy with sore eyeballs, and I saw what my buddy Spooner was doing. He had a can of green beans, and he was reaching down on the deck of that aircraft, and he was knocking a hole in that can of green beans and turning it up and drinking some bean juice. And I said, hey, Spooner, how about some of your bean juice? And, well, you'd have to know Spooner. He didn't know who I was. He couldn't see me, but he told me where I could get off. And I said, Spooner, you don't know who this is. This is Harrell. I had him tied on to me 2 nights before, and so Spooner kind of fell across some buddies with his bean juice and shared his bean juice. Okay, now we were picked up. We were taken nowhere because we couldn't take off. We waited for the Doyle to come in, and the Doyle came in that night a few hours later, and then Commander Clater turned on those lights underneath the clouds, and as you could look out of that little aircraft, and it looked like I could imagine a light under a mushroom, and it was hope for those that would still be out there until daybreak the next day. But finally, then the Doyle comes, and the Doyle is there, and I'm put aboard a stretcher, and they get me over to that little ship, and then they pull me up vertically, and I'm aboard the ship now, and a couple of sailors take my greasy arms and put around their necks, and I can't walk. They drag my feet. They take me below deck, and they take off my clothing, and they give me a kerosene or a diesel fuel bath. But by now, you can imagine I'm rotting away. Any place that anything rubbed on you now, that salt and that oil, now it's infected. So as they cleaned me off, the more they cleaned, the more I was bleeding. Well, okay, anyway, I was picked up. I'm aboard the Doyle. I'm taken to Palau. I'm in the hospital there for a couple of days, and they weren't equipped to take care of our needs much. And there was a hospital ship, the Tranquility, that came by. We were picked up. I was brought to a hospital then in Guam, and, well, I was there for a good long period of time. And finally, October the 2nd, I finally made it back to the States. July 30, October the 2nd, so I'm back in the States. And I think, I had a 90-day leave. I thought, my, I'll get to go home. But on October the 4th, I found out I wasn't going home. I had a perforated appendix. I'm in Balboa Hospital. My white blood count was of such, they said, we can't operate. Can't operate? No. And well, it was 29 days later. Well, some of you older would remember that penicillin was new. It was quite new then. I became a pincushion. The next 29 days, I took 11,800,000 units of penicillin. And I stayed in the hospital through Thanksgiving, through Christmas, through New Year's, until January the 16th. Now then, much, much more of my story, but my time is gone. And I want to read something to you. And it has to do, what were the chances that Wilbur Gwynn would spot us out in the water. Okay, Adrian Marks had picked us up. They came to our reunions and our first one was 1960, then we had it every 5 years, and then finally we had to have it every 2 years because there weren't that many of us. There are 30 of us today, and so anyway, Marks was telling the possibility of Gwynn seeing us out there in the water, and here's what he has to say, and I have it in print. It says, what were the chances that Wilbur Gwynn would fly a course which would take him directly over you? And what were the chances that his radio antenna would break while he was out on this mission? What were the chances that he would open his Bombay doors and look straight down momentarily? And what were the chances that he would look straight down on one of you? You didn't have a chance in a million. I know that most of you prayed a lot, and I know that some of you feel that it made a difference. Wilbur Gwynn is a wonderful man and a fine pilot. He never said that he heard a voice speak to him, but was there an unseen hand upon his shoulder? Did he find you by pure chance? The odds against it are 1 in a million, nay, 1 in a billion. But somehow he was chosen as the instrument to overcome these impossible astronomical odds. Wilbur Gwynn looked down at the split second that would become one of the great moments of history. I, as well as you, am proud to know him as a friend. Any sensible person knows that no one can swim for 4.5 days, and yet you did. For 40 years I have reflected upon the blind courage and the unbelievableness of greatness of spirit that I saw when each survivor was brought aboard my aircraft. And I have been compelled by the evidence of my own eyes to believe in miracles. Yes, it wasn't that I was a Marine or a good swimmer, but I look up, not a day passed, I look up, thank you, Lord. I wouldn't be here today if it was not for His providence. And because of His providence, I have the opportunities now these past years to travel the country someplace, not every week, but let's say 30 plus times a year of telling of God's providence. 317 of us survived. 30 of us are still living today. 880 of my buddies did not make it. Now, just one little bit of news for me. You know, they looked for the Indianapolis. They were not successful back some 15 years ago. But they're looking again. And they came from Britain, London, interviewed me some months or so ago, and they said, we're going to find it. We have sophisticated equipment today. We know a little more of the location from Commander Hoshimoto that sank us, and even though we're in the Marianas Trough, maybe some 5 or 7 mile deep, but they said it's like the little boy's instrument that he can just maneuver around. They said, we have sophisticated equipment that we can get down and we can see what it sees. We're going to find it. And they said, Mr. Harrell, when we find it, we're going to fly you to Guam and your son that wrote your first book. And then we're going to have a memorial service. We aren't going to move anything. We're not going to touch a thing. We're going to show you what it looks like down wherever it is. We are going to find it, and that's going to be in April this year that they're there. So we can hope and pray that we can find the Indianapolis. Now then, I think I'm going to just say again, it's an honor to be here with your people. Now, you're here on business, and I'm honored that I have this opportunity to be here to tell you of God's providence in 317 out of 1197, the largest casualty at sea in the history of the U.S. Navy. They court-martialed a good captain. It took us 50 years to prove a miscarriage of justice. We fought the Navy, the Pentagon, Washington, and you see the little movie Jaws, you know, a little Hunter Scott down in Florida, a 13-year-old boy, saw that, and he said, Dad, is what he's telling, is that factual about the Indianapolis losing all those boys? He said, why don't you take it on a little history project and see what you can find out? By the time he's 18, he's at every reunion that we have. And then when the archives are open in 95, now we go before the Armed Services Committee in Washington, and so much mud on the face of the Navy that the Armed Services Committee approved a resolution to get the good captain exonerated. Now, the good captain, though, in 1968, because he was falsely accused, it ruined him for life. He takes his little .32, puts it to his temple, and pulls the trigger. We fought for him, even though he's been gone for those years. We finally got him exonerated. And so all of that is in the book. Now then, Commander Hoshimoto, that sank us. You know, is he an enemy? He was at that time. We were an enemy of his, but he lost all of his kin relatives at Hiroshima. He met us in Hawaii, and he says, it's time that we forgive. And my Marine buddy says, forgive for what? And he tells him about him losing all of his relatives there. And he remarries, and he has a family. By now, his granddaughter comes to our reunion, and in my new book, I have a picture of his great-granddaughter and his daughter. They came to our reunion together with a husband and a couple of brothers, but the mother, anyhow, she comes, and I had spoken, and after I had spoken, I'm sure she prompted the little girl. The little girl came to me, 6 years old, and the granddad that I am, I stuck out my hands and as if to say, come. And she came. I picked her up and I set her on my knee. The mother came and we stood and we embraced in tears. My new book came out in May last 14. And when they saw that picture, the spirit of reconciliation, a half of a chapter of little Japanese great-granddaughter of Hoshimoto. Now, he's been gone for several years. I think of that. Now, there's other things that I could think of, but thank you again. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for hearing me. And some of you will be reading my book because you got my book. But it's an honor to be here and to tell you of my experience of the greatest disaster at sea in the history of the U.S. Navy. Thank you so much. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, thank you.